Hi, I'm Brant at Crocker Farm, and I want to talk about what is probably one of the most significant examples of American stoneware, at least from a historical standpoint, to surface in the last several decades, I would say. This jar is very early. I would date it to around the middle of the 18th century, and that's about as early as it gets for known pieces of American stoneware. The American stoneware potters started working, at least making stoneware, sometime around probably 1720. One of the chief original centers of American stoneware production was Manhattan. But these pieces, until about 10 years ago, would have been attributed solely to New Jersey, and not just New Jersey, but particularly to the pottery of a Revolutionary War hero, often referred to as Captain Morgan, who had a pottery in the Cheesequake / South Amboy area of New Jersey. Those pieces are often decorated with something called a watch spring design. And I'm going to show you something that's sort of a variation of that design that appears on this jar. It's this kind of squiggly design that's here, that appears here. And there's lots of different designs on this jar that I'm going to try to talk about. The Morgan pottery operated from around the third quarter of the 18th century onward. There was another pottery far west of South Amboy, in a place called, a very small area called Ringo's, New Jersey. Ringo's is near the Pennsylvania line, kind of near like Lambertville and New Hope, that little area of New Jersey. And there was a potter that started potting there around the middle of the 18th century, and his name was Johann Peter Kempel. He had come from Germany, and he was working within that German tradition of stoneware production that had dated back centuries. It's really where they started doing blue decorated, salt glazed stoneware that became traditional American ceramic form. But Johann Peter Kempel, he didn't go right from Germany to New Jersey. He went from Germany to Manhattan first. And in Manhattan, he was working with people from two of the most famous families in all of American stoneware production, the Croliuses and the Remys. The first Crolius that we know of to get here who made stoneware was Johann Wilhelm Crolius, often just called William Crolius. And the first Remy was Johannes Remy, John Remy. We often call him John Remy the First. He then had two subsequent, well, he had a child that we call John Remy Jr. and a grandson, John Remy III. And John Remy III marked his pieces around the beginning of the 19th century. And it was around that time that Manhattan stoneware potters really started marking their wares. But before then, very few pieces were signed. If they were hand inscribed on the bottom, things like that. And those pieces are extremely rare. But those pieces tend to date to around the time of the American Revolution and beyond. We don't really get any pieces from before then. So it's kind of a mystery what those potters were making in Manhattan. Where they were located in Manhattan was a place that was called for a period Potter's Hill. This was a really kind of weird place that was outside the concentrated population center at the bottom of Manhattan. It was up near a place called the Collect Pond. And out there, they were working out there alongside tan yards and things like that, other businesses that were undesirable for being in close proximity to the general population. So that Collect Pond was a pond where people could get drinking water and things like that, but it was pretty nasty, and people would throw all kinds of garbage in there, dead animals, things like that. And the potteries were right near that body of water. They were also near what was called the Negroes' Burial Ground. And we call it the African Burial Ground now, but the African Burial Ground was a place where both slaves and free blacks were buried from pretty early in the 18th century. We actually don't know when it started to be used for that purpose. And then it fell out of use much later in the century. But at least one of the pottery sites seems to have been located, if not on the burial ground, then just right adjacent to it. There were at least a couple stoneware potteries there, and they were, as I said, adjacent to the burial ground. When a construction project unearthed part of the burial ground around the early 1990s, that area was quickly cordoned off, and they excavated it, and they pulled out some extremely fascinating artifacts related to New York's early African American population, including caskets and human beings. But along with that, they dug up lots of stoneware shards, and it was the work of those archaeologists that has enabled us now to see what those early Manhattan stoneware potters were making. And the stuff they were making was very similar to the pieces previously attributed to New Jersey. The pieces that were attributed to Johann Peter Kempel, who had come to Ringo's, New Jersey by way of Manhattan, had the Watchspring type designs on them that were previously solely attributable to that Morgan pottery I spoke about in Cheesequake, New Jersey. But they were a little cruder. For instance, they had handles similar to this. They had this blue incised line that comes around here and around the base. This is very Germanic, and Kempel, who had come right out of Germany, was making things similar to what he made over there. There's no reason why he wouldn't have done that, and he continued to do that when he got over here. And Crolius and Remy did the same thing. When they pulled those shards out of the African burial ground, they found similar pieces. They had similar handles, they had these kinds of incised blue stripes, and they also had the Watchspring designs. The pieces attributable to Kempel were attributable to him because Ringo's is still not very developed. It's basically the New Jersey countryside, and lots of the shards are I'm sure there's still some in the ground, but decades ago people went out there and dug around in the ground and found shards and were able to attribute things to him. But now we can attribute very similar things, basically the same sorts of pieces, to Manhattan. And New York really was a major center of pottery production, at least stoneware. Also, easier to make low-fired earthenware, other kinds of, like some terracotta tiles, things like that. They were making those sorts of things at that Potter's Hill area. And it's my belief, or at least educated belief, that they were making far more pottery in Manhattan at that time than they were making out in Ringo's. This incised flower basket design is really unheard of in all of American stoneware. I've never seen an incised design quite like this. I've seen some brush designs that play off of this flower basket type design, but this is very intricate, and clearly, at least in my opinion, was done by a skilled potter. On the back, you have kind of a bizarre design. And I don't know, it seems to me that maybe a young apprentice or a child executed this design. It's not as finely done. And we don't know what it is. We actually had a doctor call out of the blue and say that it was definitely, he's 100% sure that it was a fetus in the womb. I've never seen a piece of stoneware with anything even close to that on it. It very well could be that, but I just am not sure what it is. I don't know if it's some kind of weird, just abstract design that someone was playing around with. But some of these other designs sort of help reinforce where we already were fairly certain this piece was made. As I talked about before, this kind of modified Watchspring design is very typical of stoneware made in that area. These flower heads show up, at least in like a stamped form, on early Manhattan stoneware. There's also some other weird designs on here, like for instance down here, there's really, I think this is supposed to be maybe an American Indian. It seems like it has a headdress and it is a humanoid form. This design also is a take on designs that were found at the African burial ground. Beneath the flower basket are the initials IS. There are two things that are interesting about that. One, Adam States was a potter who worked in Manhattan. He's one of the few people we know was a stoneware potter at that early period. He's significant because there's a teapot that he apparently made that's one of the earliest known pieces of American stoneware, period. And that teapot has this same eye with a crossbar through it on it. I've never seen that style of an eye on any other piece of American stoneware, but this says something like, it says IPR, I think. And this eye has a cross through it, just like on that States teapot. The other thing that's interesting about this IS is that on one of actually the only piece that had any kind of signature on it that they pulled out of the African burial ground actually said IS on the bottom. It's very interesting. The other thing that's interesting is this IPR. I talked about the Remy family earlier. If this I is an I, which I believe it is, Johannes Remy would have been spelling his name with an I. We don't know if he even had a middle name, but if this just said IR, I would be pretty convinced that that referred to Johannes Remy. I don't know that this does, but I am pretty convinced that this was made in Manhattan. It may have been made out in New Jersey at Ringo's, but in my opinion, the age of it is somewhere around, say, 1750. And it's pretty interesting. You can see early maps of that time period and imagine what Manhattan was like where these potters were working was just kind of a wasteland. And to be able, to see those maps and then to look at this piece and realize that it was probably made there. It's just extremely significant, and it's these kind of discoveries that really interest us, as we study American stoneware. And this jar is going to be sold on March 3rd as part of what is one of the better stoneware auctions that we've held so far.